Gracias, Chanik. Así es. Ja-Nae Duane es experta en sistemas globales. Su trabajo se centra en ayudar a corporaciones, gobiernos y universidades a comprender y desarrollar los sistemas del futuro utilizando tecnologías emergentes como realidad virtual, inteligencia artificial, blockchain, para crear innovación exponencial y predicciones futuras. Jane ha ayudado tanto a los startups como a las empresas multinacionales a identificar nuevos modelos de negocio. Actualmente es candidata al doctorado por su investigación sobre el futuro de los sistemas de información. Pero sin más preámbulos, los dejamos con la presentación y la gran experiencia de Ja-Nae. Gracias.
Buenos días. I am honored to talk to you today and really address what I consider some extremely important things as we think about reimagining the future of Mexico. But in order to think about the future, we have to start with the past. And so I actually would like to start with a story about how corn has changed the world. Now, corn is something that does not grow wild anywhere within the world. It is completely human manufactured. And it started, obviously, here in Mexico with its roots in what we know now as Central Mexico, with the teosinte, the wild grass. And it had moved from Mexico about 10,000 years through the Americas and then across to Europe. And it was Christopher Columbus who brought corn over to Europe. He actually had pockets full of corn. And this grain, this unfamiliar grain, was so delicious to him that he thought, if we can find a way to really harvest this, we can feed thousands. And so thus it began. However, up until the 1800s, corn was only used to feed the poor. It was used to feed prisoners. It was used as a commodity within trade, particularly for slave traders. And it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we saw 3 innovations change corn from going from a local harvest to something that was exported globally. And the first innovation was the iron plow. So what the iron plow allowed was it allowed for farmers to dig deeper and plant more. And so what we saw in the Midwest of the United States were the first commercial farms around corn. The second innovation was we found canneries were being built right next to these farms so that as they were harvested, they could immediately be canned. And this canning allowed for the corn to last longer. And then the third innovation was obviously the railroad. What was harvested locally now could be considered an export and could be on the table of millions of people across the world. So why am I talking to you about corn? Because corn, in many ways, exemplifies how one idea can change the world. How one idea can spark a whole ecosystem of innovation. When the Europeans saw corn, they didn't know what to do with it. And it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we saw these innovations take place. And corn now, it's found in 75% of what you find in your bodegas. It is used in paper goods, explosives, it's used in makeup, it's used in ethanol, it's used in more things than we could even imagine. And so when we think about this one idea, and when I look at some of the innovations that are coming out of Mexico today, it's just a wonderful expression of a country that honors its history while boldly looking towards the future in order to change it. And so as you go through the next few days, what I want you to really consider is, how can we take this opportunity to use technology and innovation to reimagine the future of Mexico? How can we not allow the success of the past get in the way of the success of the future? How can we keep an open mind to even some of the craziest ideas that might be out there? And really, where do we begin? How do you start to move on that? Well, I think it starts here today. I think it starts with some of the ideas that I am seeing come to reality just in the conversations that I've had today. And what I offer up to you is a framework, some initial next steps for innovation to consider as you're thinking about reimagining the future of Mexico. And they are taking a moonshot approach, creating a culture of innovation, reframing education, prioritizing entrepreneurship, training technical expertise, then continuing the digitalization of Mexico, and then having innovation-friendly policies and financial incentives. So let's dig in. When we think about the moonshot approach, well, in 1961, the space program was already in full swing when President Kennedy came to NASA and said, we need to be leaders in this war for space, and we need to put someone on the moon in the next decade. Now, this approach was something that no one really knew what to do with, but it's something that we can grasp today. It's about taking an idea, it's about taking a vision and really imagining something that is impossible by thinking differently. And we have some wonderful examples today. We have the cancer moonshot. This was presented in 2016 by then Vice President Joe Biden, where he committed $1.8 billion over 7 years around the research of cancer in order to detect, prevent, and eventually eliminate cancer. In their first 4 years, there were over 70 research groups working on this, with over 2,000 publications, over 49 clinical trials, and over 30 patents that were filed. And when I think about this cancer moonshot today, I think about a conversation that I just had with Satyan. Satyan, where are you? Raise your hand. He has a startup that is focused on solving for cancer, and they are using AI to do that, where you can have a mammogram done and get results done in seconds instead of waiting weeks upon weeks. This is where we are with technology. This is where we are when we start to think differently. We also have an example with the Moonshot Prize. This was incubated and launched by Prince William in 2020. And last year alone, they had over 750 nominees and over 86 countries represented. 55 of them were developing countries. All teams working on finding solutions over the next decade to solve for some of our environmental challenges. It is this big thinking that we have an opportunity today and over the next few days and over the next few weeks and over the next few years to really identify what could be a moonshot for Mexico. How can you create a bold vision, set clear goals, and then provide resources to think completely different than you've been thinking previously, than anyone's been thinking previously? And as you do that, you start to create a culture and an ecosystem of innovation. In nature, all living organisms and non-living organisms not only need one another to survive, but to thrive. It's the same thing when we're thinking of countries and we're thinking of ourselves as a global population. Creating an innovation ecosystem will allow for those startups to thrive, as well as large organizations who are also putting money in to really trying to tackle some of these problems for Mexicans here. And examples we have from other countries are countries like Japan. Japan has a thriving startup ecosystem. And some of the things that they've changed over the past few years is that the government is now providing support to startups and introducing them to venture capitalists where they didn't do that otherwise. Previously, historically, they were focused on companies that had legacy. But they realized over the past few years that if they are actually going to not only survive, but to thrive, that they need to raise all ships. They need to be able to bolster up these startups. Additionally, what we see is that venture capitalists, we see universities, we see corporations, all working together to find inventive economic drivers to push Japan forward. So this very much is a new Japan. We also see an example when we look at Germany. Germany has a thriving startup scene. If you go to Munich, you will find web designers, you'll find software engineers, you'll find marketers. If you go to Berlin, they are harnessing AI and looking at innovative solutions around manufacturing. And what's been really lovely is that e-commerce and IT have been working with the government and their Digital Agenda 2020 to really provide the opportunity and the subsidies and the tax incentives needed for these startups to thrive. So I ask you, what are some of the things that you can do here in Mexico to create that ecosystem? If we're going to create this ecosystem, then we are going to need talent from everywhere. And that means reframing education. Education should not just be for those who can afford it. If you are poor, that doesn't mean that you don't have any different ideas or shouldn't have access to education than someone who can afford that education. You should be able to access emerging technologies, to work with like-minded individuals. But if we're going to reframe education, then the first thing that we need to do is to start by changing mindsets. Nothing new is ever created by using the same mindset, by using the same heuristics, by using the same biases. By really changing mindsets, what we can do is reinvent what education looks like. We can train people not only to be entrepreneurial, not only to be resilient, but to have an anti-fragility mind, a mind that can embrace shock, a mind that is ready for anything. Because as we are looking at some of these exponential technologies, we will not be able to keep up unless if we change our mindsets first. Some of my work as a behavioral scientist is working with clinicians and doctors around their patient experience. And who you see here is Dr. Justin Saunders. It's an avatar of an actual doctor. And what we have doctors do is we have them provide a diagnosis that they would normally give a patient, but they are sitting in the patient's chair. And I am blown away at how doctors respond. They are amazed at how much they need to change their approach to medicine, how much they need to change their approach to care. And so in many ways, this behavior change is the future of healthcare. We also see this with training in restaurants, particularly training individuals who have disabilities. By putting them in VR and in augmented reality experiences, what they are able to do is run through scenarios that they might come across in a restaurant and decide on how they might handle that, but in a safe environment. We can change behaviors, and we can change how we think about how we really connect with this technology. And we see this within education. This is an example of Snap AR, which is an environmentally friendly AR to tell you what street you're on, as well as the depth of the building. Education is not just within the classroom, it's everywhere. We can use immersive storytelling to allow for our students to not only consume content, but to be a part of the creation of that story, to really imagine the way in which we can move a story forward and how they can use their creativity in ways that we probably, as older folks, have lost. So giving them that ability is vital. And as we are really reframing education, the next thing that we need to do is prioritize entrepreneurship. The way that I see it, entrepreneurship is the engine that is going to fuel Mexico into the future. And I mean, I travel around the world, and I talk to many, many entrepreneurs. I've spoken to 2 of them here today, which has been a lovely way to spend my morning. But what I see, particularly with young entrepreneurs, is that they don't want to build the next app. They want to contribute. They want to contribute to their communities. They want to contribute to their country. They want to really make a difference and to serve others. And I see it with folks like Jose Torres and Byron Amores. So they have their co-founders, and they have a startup called Habits AI. And what they are focused on is they're focused on hacking health for Mexicans. They are focused on really identifying what ways in which an individual not only can live healthier, but can live longer. I see it with Diana Daniels. She is the CEO of Tinderlink, and it is a social marketplace that helps individuals not only find jobs, but they also help individuals who are unbanked to be able to provide a way to receive funds. They help individuals with education, and you can see the impact that they're making. They help at least 2,000 people a month find jobs, and they have served over 20,000 people. And Diana and her team are just getting started. These are examples of what entrepreneurship looks like here in Mexico. These are examples of individuals who are looking to serve and need support in order to do so. And as we start to prioritize entrepreneurship and have a spirit of innovation, what we will also need to do is start to train for technological expertise. Digital transformation has totally changed how we interact with technology. And so training individuals in a completely different way to create training programs like you see here for engineers, or maybe to create an augmented reality app so that others can use it within their industry. Much like we're seeing construction being transformed with the use of augmented reality to be able to really identify quality assurance even before a structure has been built. These are the skills, the technical skills that we're looking at as we're looking to the future. And I also ask you to continue the digitalization of Mexico. When we think about where we are headed, and we think about so many of the innovation success stories that we see out there, there are so many opportunities right now that are being missed by medium and small enterprises here in Mexico because the work needs to continue around digitizing these public data records and services. This is a large part of what will help this innovation ecosystem. And it will help startups, but it also help large organizations as they are looking at digital twins of their infrastructure. And a digital twin, if you don't know, is a digital version of a physical asset. And you can have a digital twin of a building. You can have a digital twin of a supply chain. You can also have a digital twin of a city. This is an example of Singapore. Singapore uses their digital twin for traffic. They use it for urban planning. They use it for infrastructure. And they also use it for disaster preparedness. So being able to focus on this digitalization of Mexico will also help you to identify what are some of the large projects as we move into the future that need to be a priority. Because as we think about the future of Mexico, we also need to consider the data. What we are finding is that with digital transformation and the exponential growth of data, as well as the growth of emerging technologies, these are actually eroding our current infrastructure and information systems. So we need to find ways to utilize what is now considered our most important commodity. And so I ask you, really, how can we take ownership over our data and create a new Mexico around it? How can we allow for citizens of Mexico to own their data and also get monetized in order to share it? And finally, I'd like you to consider policies and financial incentives that are friendly to innovation as well as entrepreneurship. And the three that I'd like to touch upon today are tax incentives for R&D, government research grants, as well as human capital policies for innovation. When we think about tax incentives, I again think about my conversation with Satyan. He ended up using the company's own money to do the research that they needed in order to build their product. With tax incentives, you really release the burden from the startups so that they can then identify how can we take bigger risks in order to move forward. When we look at government research grants, these grants are for those projects that are very high risk, that really would not be done otherwise unless if they had a bit of government support. And so to have a research grant not only allows for collaboration, but it also allows for knowledge transference across many sectors. And then finally, as we're thinking about this framework for innovation, there are human capital policies for innovation to consider. On the supply side, if we are not creating a bigger pool of innovators and potential innovators, then our future skilled workforce will just diminish. So being able to provide policies that are friendly to innovators are key. It also acts as a signal that the government supports innovation in a vibrant community as we're thinking about technology in the future. And I will say that what I'm recommending today is difficult. It will not be easy. But this is the time. This is the time in which we are all being called upon to answer very large questions. This is the time in which we are all being called on to collaborate. And I know that you can do it because I know that you're not alone. You have friends globally. And I know that we can do this together because we are only limited by our imaginations. We can create ecosystems of innovation where new things are explored. We can reframe education. We can prioritize entrepreneurship to help this new wave of entrepreneurs come into the light. We can help train new technological expertise while providing a continued digitalization of Mexico, as well as providing policies and financial incentives that are friendly. As Mexico is looking to the future, you today, in this moment, have an opportunity to reimagine what that future might look like and how wild that might be. And with that, I ask you to change the world. Gracias. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ja-Nae. Sin duda alguna, la innovación y la tecnología son cruciales para superar desafíos que presentamos en este momento. Ahora vamos a tener una ronda de preguntas y respuestas y bueno, pues hablando de tecnología y de innovación es a través de una aplicación. Entonces, con sus celulares ustedes pueden escanear el código QR que están viendo en las pantallas y ahí hacer las preguntas. Estas preguntas pueden votar por las mejores preguntas, vamos a ver cuáles son las mejores preguntas y se le van a hacer a Ja-Nae. So, I'm going to ask you a few questions.
Please.
So that all of our auditorium can receive the answers. Considering the rapid growth of artificial intelligence, AI, do you believe there should be limits imposed on its development?
I'm actually going to take this off so I can answer you.
Yes.
The thing is how do you limit something that we have yet to fully scope and we have yet to define? And so when we think about emerging technologies, we are really just at the cusp. So how do you begin to even try to limit some of that development? I will say that as we're thinking about this development, there are some standards that can be put into place. You can have government oversight as to whether or not, say, the startups or companies are meeting those standards. You can also have oversight if for some reason harm has been done to a user or to a consumer, then what are those consequences? But when we think about these emerging technologies, we are just at the cusp, and we have yet to really, truly understand what their definitions are as well as their scope.
Thank you. Follow-up question. How can artificial intelligence be leveraged to promote more ecologically efficient practices in various industries, while also considering the potential ethical implications?
Yeah. What I love is that there are a ton of examples out there already. AI is being used in environmentally friendly ways all the time. So an example is actually Climate.io uses AI and works with a coalition to help small farmers in Africa identify when they might need insurance based on when a storm is going to come, because the small farmers wouldn't be able to afford insurance otherwise. We also see AI being used within digital twins. And what I love about the use of digital twins is that it really helps with the efficiency of our manufacturing, of our supply chain, so that we are really mitigating for some of those environmental impacts that we make on a daily basis.
That's very, very interesting. Another question. As artificial intelligence continues to evolve, what key considerations should businesses and governments address to ensure responsible development and deployment of AI systems?
Absolutely. So I would say that the one thing that we, at least within the US, are focused on is the need for standards, but to also work globally around those standards. Because when we think about these technologies, they're not limited to a country. And so this is really where we need to reach across borders and understand we're in this together, and we need to understand how do we identify the best way to leverage these technologies in the future. The other thing to consider is that, particularly with AI right now, the that is being developed by developers. And so there needs to be a level of accountability if there is harm being done by a technology. However, we will come to a point where AI will be self-learning. We call it reinforcement learning. And so having those conversations now about when we are really there and utilizing, and it's there, but it's not, it has a long way to go. Having those conversations now will set us up for the future to identify what type of regulation may be needed, but on a global level.
Thank you very much. We have another question, which I think is very, very interesting. What tools, in your experience, can help us to change the mindset of new generations of educators to go from only learning to creating learning, creative learning?
I love this. I love this question. And as a professor, I particularly love this. And as a mother of a 6-year-old, one of the things that I think is imperative is to actually use VR, virtual reality, as a way to start to explore various scenarios. Also allowing for children to identify how they would use it if they were trying to learn something new. So in many ways, instead of the rote learning that we're used to, how do we provide this foundational learning of, we are teaching critical thinking. We are teaching individuals, no matter what age, not what to learn, not what to think, but how to think, so that they can think for themselves, so that they can learn for themselves and decide on how they leverage these technologies in order to do so.
Of course. It's very interesting what you say about learning to learn. You know, like you have to let them learn how to learn by themselves. Another question that I think is very interesting also, how can we implement the technology and proposals that you mentioned earlier in wretched communities without internet or access to information?
Yeah, no, this is a very important question. One of the things that's going to need to happen is really when we think about 5G technology, 6G technology, when we think of these communities, much of this can't happen unless they have that type of access. So how do we provide some of that access? What does that roadmap look like so that then they're able to have, just like with the internet, and you think about the amount of education, informal education individuals receive because they have access to the internet. So it's going to be that critical piece that is going to, what I consider, unlock this for many of those communities that currently don't have that access.
Thank you very much. In your experience, what would you think the regulations that create harder entry barriers, what are the regulations that create harder entry barriers for entrepreneurs?
I find that when there's regulations that prohibit either the use of a technology or even the exploration of a technology or even bringing it to market, I find that that hinders entrepreneurs sometimes even more than the lack of tax incentives. Because tax incentives in many ways reduce that financial risk, but if you have regulations around technology specifically, or the use of technology, then that ends up becoming a complete a completely different conversation, and you might find that those entrepreneurs go elsewhere and maybe even move out of the country.
Wow, that's very, very.
I see it all the time.
Do you think bilingual education, English and Spanish, is important for a country like Mexico to access to better jobs?
I think that that is a great question. I actually would encourage everyone to learn Chinese. But I do recommend, and I am an example of this, where if it's not within your education, which unfortunately it was not within mine. I know a little bit of Italian because I used to be an opera singer. But if you don't have at least a base knowledge of another language, then I just find that anyone is at a disservice in this competitive market.
Yes, you're completely right. This is the last question. Esta es la
Please.
última pregunta. What manner can we ensure that the integration of emerging technologies mentioned before contributes to sustainable development and addresses environmental concerns?
Honestly, there are so many entrepreneurs out there that want to make a change. And much to what they find is that, one, they're looking for the support from their government. Two, they're looking for like-minded individuals who really want to change the world, who want to contribute. And it's being able to provide that platform, create that ecosystem so that they find one another. But they're there and they're here in this room, and we just need to get out of their way sometimes. So
Thank you very much, Ja-Nae.
thank you so much.